Welcome to Cure Connections. Thank you for joining us. I'm John Hopper. I'm the president of the Fibrolamellar Cancer Foundation. I'm on the board of the National Pancreas Foundation, and I'm the co-chair of the GI Cancers Alliance. Most people have probably never heard of fibrolamellar hepatocellular carcinoma, or more familiarly called fibrolamellar. It's a very rare type of cancer. In fact, it's called an ultra-rare cancer, and it's a cancer of the liver. The cancer affects adolescents and young adults, so 12 to 35-year-olds. And actually, it's a very aggressive cancer where there's been very little research done until the formation of the Fibrolamellar Cancer Foundation. And Tom, whose son Robert had fibrolamellar, was diagnosed at the age of 18. And Tom, we're very fortunate to have you here, and we want to hear more about the story of you and Robert. So welcome to Cure Connections.
Thank you, John. Great to be here.
Tom, I'd like to find out more about the initial diagnosis of Robert. What was it that you and Carrie thought Robert had? What brought you to the doctors? What were the symptoms? Bring me through that journey.
He ended up having several flu bugs through the fall. It was back in 2013. And the flu seemed to continually get worse. And by the time we reached December, he was starting to get fever, some anemia type symptoms, and he felt that he was constipated and his stomach started to distend. And so we ended up taking him to the primary care physician. It was his fourth visit in, and we ended up getting a ultrasound. And that ultrasound turned out that when they found it, it was 26 centimeter tumor that was on his liver. So we were told immediately go to the ER, get an emergency CT scan, and when that was performed, they of course confirmed that diagnosis, and they referred us out to a larger medical center.
So you went to a regional hospital?
We did. It was in Orange County. We went to that hospital. We saw a liver specialist at the time, and they ran several tests. They did a biopsy. They did, of course, MRI scans. And within less than a week, they came back with the diagnosis of fibrolamellar.
So you hear the word fibrolamellar, what goes through your mind? Have you ever heard of it before?
Never heard of it at all. It was quite a shock, and when we looked at the potential statistics and things for it, it was quite a shock. So we really had to try and regroup from that point because we didn't know what this cancer was about.
So as you heard that and you said you had to regroup, what kind of questions did you have?
Number one, for his, it was such an advanced cancer, what can we really do? It was something that we couldn't just simply give him a systemic treatment because his cancer was so advanced. He also had disease in the right atrium of his heart. So what we had to do was reach out to as many surgeons as we could to try and resect the disease.
Right.
Of course, at that point, we had gone to UCLA, and it was again, like I had mentioned, so advanced at this stage, he went into hepatic encephalopathy.
You talk about an advanced stage, that's stage 4 is what you're talking about.
That's correct.
Is that common for fibrolamellar patients based on the type of symptoms you said Robert had, which do not sound like they're cancer symptoms?
Right.
So is that what most patients find when they go in, that they're at stage 4?
They do, and that's the hardest part of this cancer, is because there are not many warning symptoms. If you're fortunate enough to have pain, my son never had any of that type of pain that's associated. So here he has this 26 centimeter tumor growing in him with no pain, and it had all this time to spread, all during a time that you didn't really realize what's going on in the background.
Once you started to do some initial research, et cetera, what was that approach? Did you build a team? Did you do this on your own? Did you have advocates with you? What was that whole process of discovery?
We did it all on our own, and I started to search. I mean, doctors tell you typically don't Google search, but that's in this type of cancer because it's so rare.
Right.
That's what I had to do. And I had to reach out to many different doctors, many different studies that I read, looked up things on PubMed, went to the NIH site. So all these different things that you do to try and figure out, okay, what are our next steps? What can we do?
And were there any of those particularly helpful to you that you would say would be, the top resources that you and the family sought out?
I think there were many. Actually, even the Fibrolamellar website, Facebook page, that was helpful because we were able to see stories of other patients that were in similar type situations. And so it did help quite a bit.
So social media plays a big role?
It does. I think social media, the studies, talking to the experts, it all mattered. And for Robert, he ended up having a life-saving transplant and then, open heart surgery at the same time. So for him, those were the things that ultimately saved his life at that point, which then allowed us to get to the next phase of trying to figure out the treatment plan.
We know that fibrolamellar is an ultra-rare cancer, which means it's 1 in 5 million, I believe, in terms of the incidences of the cancer. How did you find that, the fact that your son had an ultra-rare cancer? Resource-wise, support groups, what was facing you and the family at the time?
Well, very difficult, because where do you turn? And even the medical community didn't have a good understanding of it. There wasn't really a set systemic cure. The idea was to have complete resection. And so you were very limited with regards to, the resources that were available. But that's where you continue on and you look at all these different studies, and you have to ask quite a few questions. I mean, and that's what I did. And we would develop these questions and try to create that right treatment plan for Robert.
And did you find the challenges you had facing a rare cancer different than those of other people you may have spoken to who had more common cancers?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, because of the medical community not understanding this cancer. Even the insurance companies, they didn't even know how to classify. So what would end up happening is they would put it on the sheet, or Robert's file, and it was like, well, what is this? Is this HCC? What is this cancer? And so we would always have to do that, the battle to get it diagnosed properly for the insurance companies.
Gotcha. Well, we certainly at the Fibrolamellar Cancer Foundation certainly go forward to those who we connect with, which is you've got to be your own best advocate. Who were members of your healthcare teams? Tell me a little bit more about the whole advocacy. Did you get second and third opinions? What were you doing, in terms of basically being the advocate for you and your family?
Well, absolutely we had to, because again, Robert's situation was so dire at first. So it was getting a surgeon that was willing to do it. That was number one. And then after we had that, and Robert successfully recovered from the transplant, then we had to figure out, okay, now what do we do? So we involved, so many people were involved with Robert's treatment. I mean, first off, you would interview multiple doctors on different subjects, but we were talking interventional radiologists, we were talking oncologists, we were talking surgeons, different types of surgeons, even social workers and case managers. And so it was a complete group of people that you'd reach out to, as well as people in the community within the fibrolamellar community that understood the cancer. So it took a lot of different team members to come together.
And in terms of getting second and third opinions, overrated, a necessity? What do you think?
Definitely a necessity. You should do it. I mean, Robert ended up with 9 different oncologists. So it wasn't something that just one size fits all with one particular doctor. And so you really do have to go out and get that have that person that's really on your side, who really is advocating for you. I think that's extremely important.
So if there was a bit of advice that you would have for other patients and caregivers like yourself about advocating for yourself, what would that be? Are there resources they can go to? Is there a way they can kind of find it in a box and then become an advocate? I mean, what would that advice be?
Well, I'll tell you, it's very, very difficult because you're so in a state of shock when
Yeah.
you first hear this. What you have to do is become partnered with people. I think the social media is important.
Yep.
I think what we're doing at the foundation is very important as well, where as patient navigator, I can help answer some of those questions.
Right.
And so I think that's a real key issue, is that people have to be able to feel comfortable in reaching out and asking those tough questions.
What are the key questions that a advocate needs or a patient needs in terms of asking the medical team? And is it easy to ask the medical team questions about the cancer that you have?
Oftentimes it's not, because I think the medical teams are feeling frustrated, especially with the fibrolamellar type cancer, because they don't really have a lot of go-to solutions.
Okay.
So that's where I think it's really important, again, for that patient to advocate for themselves.
Right.
It's important to do things like your genetic mutational studies to
Right.
be able to come up with the idea that one size doesn't fit all patients. And that, I think, is really critically important as well.
Right. Did you find that the medical team you had was open for you to bring in other medical professionals outside of their institution, or advising you to bring in other kinds of consultants? Or
Typically not, because there's a certain bit of ego to many of these institutions.
Right.
And so we found that we ended up educating a lot of them on the disease.
Right.
And some were more willing than others to accept some of those ideas. And again, you figure 2 out of 9 oncologists were totally on board and accepting. And so it's very difficult when they don't have an answer.
My last question for you here is, we talk about something called a survivorship plan, and that is for those who are, looking to maintain their health, during and post-treatment along the way there. Why is that important? And
Well,
what have you seen with other patients and caregivers?
there are many patients that we've found that actually go in after a resection that do not have the disease, or there's no evidence of disease found.
That's great.
There are many of these patients that go 5, 6, 10. We've had patients up to 20 years plus with no evidence of disease. But part of the reason for that is they're very vigilant. They do a
Right.
great job at getting their CT scans. Sometimes they'll rotate it between the
Yep.
MRIs and CT scans. And so when we talk about survivorship, is that just because you've now gotten rid of the cancer, it's a type of cancer that can recur.
Right.
It often does, and so you have to make sure that you're maintaining a watchful eye all the time. So I think that's very
And
important.
does that survivorship plan come from your medical community, or does that come from a variety of sources?
Well, it would mainly come from you utilizing the medical community with what's there, and being able to take advantage of that. I don't think you would ever want to get to a point where you say, well, I don't need to do this
Right.
anymore, because it's very simple. A lot of patients want to go into denial, and once it's gone, out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah.
That's not the case with fibrolamellar. Again, you have to remain on guard all the time.
It's a very aggressive cancer, isn't it?
It
Yeah.
certainly can be, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So you want to be as
Great.
cautious as
Great.
possible.
So if you had to take a step back and say what you've learned from your experience in the fibrolamellar challenge, I'll call it, what would some of the top things you would say is from your learning curve that would be helpful for other patients and caregivers who might be watching this video right now?
Well, I would say first you have to take a really big, deep breath. And you have to be able to do the research, become your own advocate, because of the fact that there isn't a lot of support out there. Definitely social media, which is a big help, so we
Right.
can learn synergistically from one another, which I think is a real key aspect of it, and create a really good team. So what you have to do is surround yourself with doctors that have a good understanding of the cancer, who are supportive of you. I think that is a real key, because of the fact that there isn't a set group of rules, if you will, for this cancer, or how to treat it, you need to be able to do that.
Tom, we were talking about advocacy. Now, I understand that you have a new position.
I do. I am the patient navigator for the foundation.
And the foundation thanks you for that because it's a much needed position. Tell me what your role is. And first of all, tell me why you want to do this. And then tell me specifically what your role is as patient navigator.
The why is pretty simple, because I watched what Robert and our family went through for the past 3.5 years. And if I can help any of the families, any of the patients, to provide them any ease along their journey, then it will be worth it. And Robert and I will be ecstatic about that, because Robert, of course, his heart was always with all the fibrolamellar patients. He cared a great deal about them.
So as the navigator, what is your role? And importantly, what are you starting to see as questions coming up from the community?
Well, interestingly, on the questions, one of the most asked, I think, is, I just recently had a resection, and now what do I do? Do I do systemic treatment? What should be the next plan? Or I'll hear from new patients who they don't know what to expect. They're fearful. They have no idea about what's going on with this particular type of cancer. And so I provide filling in a lot of those gaps and the information that took, quite honestly, it took us maybe a year to get to that point. And if I can save people that time, that's one of the major roles that I feel I'm going to fill. Also filling things like notifying them of clinical trials that might be available, tissue collection, which we're in the process now at the foundation of creating that strong biobank.
And why is that important?
Well, it's extremely important because we have a group of researchers that are doing some incredible work. And the one thing that they require is tissue. And they require a lot of tissue so that they can utilize it for their studies and hopefully for a drug discovery at some point.
Would that be wonderful?
Oh, it would be amazingly wonderful. Yeah, absolutely. So that's just part of it. And it really, too, is my position is it's learning as you go, because I'm letting the community tell me what they need. And the more they explain to me, and I'll be able to adjust kind of on the fly and be able to fill in some of these gaps, because I really need them to reach out to me and say, this is what I wish we saw more of, or we needed more of. And so that's what I would be able to fill.
Great. So you are become the comfortable go-to person for patients and caregivers when they have questions, when they need a sounding board, when the foundation or researchers need to have biospecimens and things like that to continue the research. You're that conduit, is that right?
That's exactly right, is so that I can work as that typical, the advocate of going between all of those that you mentioned. I mean, and I think that's extremely important.
That's great. So as a patient comes to you or a caregiver, or as an advocate, can you give medical advice, or do you tell them information you have and then they go to their physician or?
Yeah, absolutely no. I'm not a medical doctor. The foundation isn't a medical doctor. So what we do is we guide them. I mean, we will provide maybe questions to ask their medical team. What I found is each patient has unique situation. Some may be diabetic, some may have rheumatoid arthritis, some may have certain things. There's no way in the world that you have one size fits all. So I would never want to confuse that as offering that. I think the patient's medical team is critical. I think I can help them get the most out of that medical team, and that's how I see it, but certainly never providing medical advice.
So my last question on this is, as you have now stepped forward as a patient navigator, again, a much needed position and go-to person, I know, for this ultra-rare cancer. What's the best way for other patients to get involved if they want, or other caregivers?
Well, we find a couple great ways. I mean, with our social media that we discussed before, there's some great groups within that fibrolamellar community that they reach out. Some people do some great outreach among those, individuals. They can certainly reach out to me at the website, or we can certainly reach me on my email.
Is there an email address, Tom, for you?
There is. It's tstockwell@FibroFoundation.org. Yeah,
Great.
exactly.
Good.
So, and I would love to hear from anyone, especially with ideas and how I can help serve the community better.
Well, this has been great, Tom, and wonderful education for our patient and caregiving community. Thanks so much for sharing your story. Thank you for sharing Robert with us. Thank you for having Carrie share Robert with us. Wonderful member of the community, and we're so happy that you're able to share everything you can. Much of what we're talking about today can be found on one of two websites, either FibroFoundation.org or on GICancersalliance.org. So please make sure you use those resources for any further information or contact you need on fibrolamellar.